5 forces that have shaped the modern secular mind. That's what we're going to be talking about this evening. And I apologise for this. This is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Maybe for some of you this is going to feel like being taken back to school. Again, I apologise again for that. And you might want to get a hold of it. I think it's being filmed tonight. So yes, it is. So you might want to go back and revisit the video evidence afterwards to perhaps refresh yourself if you need to. But the most important thing I'm going to say to you tonight is this, that all glory goes to God for anything good you receive in the session. All the rubbish, that's my fault, and please God, you forget it before you've even left the room tonight. Just a little bit about me by way of introduction. This is my wife, Katie. We've been married for 21 years. We live in Rangiora, just north of Christchurch. Yes, that map of New Zealand is completely outsized compared to Australia. I'm actually going to speak at a big youth conference in Melbourne next weekend, and I like to remind our Australian brethren of how important we are in relation to them, so I always show them this map. We live, as I said, in Rangiora, North Canterbury, and we've got 5 children. I also have one other contractual obligation to my children. Wherever I go, they say, "Dad, show them a photograph of our cat Ignatius." So that's our cat Ignatius. I've been working full-time now for over 21 years in pro-life, marriage and family ministry. And I have an organisation called LifeNet. You can find out more about what we do at lifenet.org.nz if you are interested. Okay, 5 forces that have shaped the modern secular mind. Why does this matter, I think, is the first question. And I guess we could be tempted to say, well, isn't this all just very academic? You know, we're talking about philosophies and ideologies and things like this. To which I would say no, because what we're actually talking about here is something called anthropology. And anthropology and reality are of fundamental importance. Anthropology is what it means to be human. And if you understand what it is to be human, you get that right, then your life will make sense. Your search for meaning will make sense. But if you get these wrong, then you will get questions of meaning, of human flourishing, how do I live a full and flourishing human life, and of human society wrong. Effectively, you end up with chaos in one way or another. So anthropology, what it means to be human, is so fundamentally important. So that's why this matters. Secondly, I think we're living in a culture now where there is a particular idea that is actually woefully incorrect, but it is a very popular one, and that is the idea that if you are a person of faith, you're a religious believer of some kind, then you have some bias. So when a big issue comes up for discussion, let's say a question about abortion laws is on the table and there's a public debate about it in the public square, the assumption is that if you're a religious believer, you have bias. And if you are not religious, you're an atheist or an agnostic, you don't have any bias, you're objective. Spoiler alert, that is not true. Everyone has bias, okay? Everyone brings a vision of reality, a view of the world to the table when these issues are discussed. So the question is not, do you have bias? The question is your bias good, true, and beautiful or not? And of course, Your Honour, I'm going to argue in the affirmative that the Christian vision of reality is not just good, true, and beautiful, but it is the best of the best, okay? It is profoundly beautiful and profoundly important for our lives. I think this also matters if you're a person of faith who is doing your best to follow Christ in the Christian tradition. It matters for when we think about something like Christian discipleship, because we have to keep asking ourselves this important question: what is actually informing the shape and the trajectory of my life? Is it a genuine Christian vision of reality, what St. Paul in Philippians calls the mind of Christ that we're supposed to have? Or is it just the dominant ideologies of our age? Are they the things? And even as people of faith, for those in the room tonight who are, this is a challenge for us. We constantly have to be aware of. We are all like frogs sitting in that pot, that culture that we're living in. And it has an impact on all of us, sometimes in big and sometimes in small ways. And so it's important to be discerning in that regard. And lastly, before we jump into these 5 powerful forces that have shaped the modern secular mind, my hope tonight is that if nothing else, that what you'll get out of this session is a renewed confidence in the Christian vision of reality. As Christians, you should have every confidence in the goodness, truth and beauty of the Christian tradition. I think often we're made to feel like somehow we're on a separate playing field. People who have faith are somehow not like those other people who perhaps profess some sort of scientific position on an issue. No. We're all on the same playing field here, and we should have great confidence. This Christian vision of reality has profoundly shaped the world in very important ways. So when people say to me, so I'm often, for example, asked to speak about bioethics issues. So the non-controversial stuff that everyone loves to talk about, and no one gets upset when you have to talk publicly about abortion or euthanasia and things like that. And it's not uncommon to have people suggest to me, oh yeah, you're just saying that because you're a Christian. And I used to feel a bit embarrassed about that, but now I'm quite happy to say, yeah, I'm proud of that fact. My tradition has given the world a beautiful vision of human dignity and respect for every life, and that matters. And that really does matter. So I hope you have renewed confidence. I have chosen here the picture of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz because the other thing I think you find that's important is once you understand a little bit more about the culture that we're living in and the various forces that really shape and drive it, it's kind of like The Wizard of Oz. Everyone is afraid of the great and powerful Oz, right? The very dominant, strong, loud sort of cultural voices of our age, the secular ideology which really does hold a lot of sway and a lot of power. But then what happens when you find yourself in the middle of Oz? You pull back the curtain and what is it? Just a little man pulling a few levers, right? And all of a sudden you realise, this is not quite as big and as impressive as I first thought it was. So as I said, my hope is that tonight you'll have a renewed confidence in that Christian vision of reality, or at the very least a recognition for just how profoundly good, true and beautiful it really is. What I'm going to do tonight, by the way, is I'm going to work my way through these 5 powerful secularizing forces that have shaped the modern secular mind. I'm going to tell you where they came from, what was their origin, and then I'm going to work my way through each one, and I'm going to respond with how is the Christian vision of reality different? What is our Christian difference on each of these points? And I've made it nice and easy and straightforward here, so you'll see the secular on the left and the Christian on the right. That is not done on purpose, by the way. It's not a political statement, it just happened to be that way, okay? Seriously, I really do mean that. Okay, so the first hallmark and very powerful secularizing force that tends to shape the secular mind is this belief that we as persons are actually disembodied. Now let me explain what I mean by that and where this idea came from. It comes to us courtesy of this man here, René Descartes. And René Descartes is an important figure for a lot of reasons. Does anybody know what René Descartes' famous maxim or saying was?
I think before I am.
Yeah, very good. Does anybody know what it is in Latin? Cogito ergo sum. I delivered a retreat to 125 clergy in Broken Bay in Australia last year, and I asked that question. No one said it in English. Everyone shouted it in Latin at me. So very different response. But don't panic. Most people don't remember the Latin version. I think, therefore I am. And what René Descartes is doing here is he's responding to a question when he says this: how do I know that I really exist? And it's actually pretty simple but pretty profound, that statement, when you think about it. Basically what he says is, well, if you are thinking and you're asking yourself that question, how do I know that I exist? You obviously exist, because if you didn't exist, you wouldn't be able to think and ask yourself that question. Pretty straightforward, right? The problem, though, with Descartes is he creates a philosophy of the human person which splits us into 2. It is called Cartesian dualism. Cartesian after Descartes, his last name, and dualism as in 2. And what René Descartes says is that basically the human person is not their body. A human person is a consciousness or a soul or a mind, some might say today, that inhabits a body, and the body is like a machine. Has anybody seen the Men in Black movies? In one of those films, I can't remember which one, there is an alien that looks, for all intents and purposes, like a human being, until this human head opens up and you realize it's like a robot, it's a machine, and there's a tiny little alien at the controls. That is a great metaphor for Descartes. He believes you are the tiny little alien at the controls, but you're just a soul. You're not a material body. Your body is like a machine. And there are various versions of this idea that still persist today. Now, first of all, this idea has profound implications for knowledge and truth. Because how do you know anything that you know about the world? All of your knowledge came to you from your 5 bodily senses. But remember, according to Descartes, you are not your body. Your body's just a machine. So the obvious question that people start to ask before even the death of Descartes is, well, how do I know anything that my body has told me about the world is true? Remember, I'm just a soul. according to Descartes. I can't step outside and check that my body's, calibrated properly and is giving me the correct information. And this begins to introduce into the Western thought an irrational form of skepticism. And this today has got to the point where there are people being taken seriously and who have submitted academic papers claiming that we are living in a matrix-like simulation. We're all plugged into a machine somewhere and none of this is real. We're actually disembodied. We just don't know it. The whole thing's a simulation. This is why you have people today who say things like, nothing is knowable for certain, which obviously is contradictory, because if nothing's knowable for certain, then how can you know for certain that nothing's knowable for certain? You've created a certainty. The irony, the paradox here, of course, is that in order to have uncertainty, you actually have to have certainty. Uncertainty can't exist otherwise. There has to be a certainty as a counterpoint for that. But how does this shape the modern secular culture in a practical level? Well, what this does is this leaves us with the wrong idea about ourselves that we in actual fact are persons without bodies. We are souls or consciousnesses or minds that just inhabit a body. Think about where this plays out practically. And I'll give you some concrete, tangible examples of this in conversations and ideas that are very relevant for us today. In the issue of abortion, it is not uncommon to hear people say things like, I don't believe that an unborn child is a human person until it's developed consciousness. That's not a scientific idea, that's René Descartes. The suggestion is that you're not a person unless you have consciousness. Your consciousness is what makes you a person. The whole gender debate that happens so ferociously at times in our culture, when you hear the phrase, I was born in the wrong body. That's a Cartesian idea. When you think about the issue of sex and relationships, when people say, it was just a physical thing we did. No, it's always personal. The whole person is involved in the most intimate act between two persons. It's not just two bodies doing this. And of course, the big push that's happening right now for us all to live in the virtual reality. Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse. We'll all be happy living in a virtual reality as if somehow our bodies actually don't matter, as if they're secondary to our human flourishing. So, what would Christianity want to say in response to this idea? And by the way, this is a very powerful idea that really has shaped the modern world in a lot of very important ways. Christianity would say, well, no, in our vision of reality, we are not disembodied, we are incarnational beings. We are beings, we are souls incarnated into a body. So for Christianity, we are not materialists. And materialism is the opposite of Cartesian dualism. So people straight away, or not long after, saw the flaws in Descartes' ideas and they said, well, maybe then we must just be bodies with no souls whatsoever. See that opposite? That's also incorrect. Christianity says that the human person is a unified whole of body and soul. They are both fundamentally part of the person and they both matter. Think about just a basic reality which really does show this point, I think, in a powerful way. When you sleep at night, when you go to sleep, you do not cease to be a person, despite the fact that you have no consciousness, no self-awareness. You slip into a state of unconsciousness for 8 hours and you don't even realize time has passed. You do not do anything exclusively human in your sleep, but you don't cease to be a person. You are still fundamentally there and present as a person. In the Christian vision of reality, the human body is profoundly important. We see this in one of the most important doctrines of the Christian tradition, which is the doctrine of the incarnation, God who becomes man in the form of Jesus Christ. Profoundly important belief of Christianity. And it's one thing to say, well, we believe in a God who takes on human form. That's quite amazing. That is profoundly unique. If you're going to look at all the world religions and consider differences, that really is a fundamental difference. That God would come that close to his creation and become one of them, that is profound. But there's more going on than just that. Think about the resurrection. We believe in a bodily resurrection. Christ rose bodily from the grave. He kept his body. And it's not just that, but we believe in a bodily ascension. He ascended to the right hand of the Father and kept that body. He didn't say, oh, thank goodness, I'm sick of this meat suit or this meat machine. I can be rid of it now. He kept it. And that is profound. That says a lot about the profound worth of the human body in the Christian vision of reality. God kept that human body, and we would say that when he ascended to the right hand of the Father, there is a full redemption of the human body that's happening after the fall as well. He's taking it back into the life of God with him. It's very profound stuff. And of course, this is reflected in the Christian creed, where we say that we believe in a final bodily resurrection. Not just will be disembodied spirits, but we're meant to have bodies. They're fundamentally part of who we are. And of course, this is such a profound belief for Christianity that even when a person has died, we still show reverence to their body. We recognize that there's something sacred here of the person still. Even though there has been a separation of body and soul, we still show reverence to the body in the way that we treat it. That's profoundly important. Okay? So for the Christian vision of reality, we're a unified whole of both body and soul. Your body is not simply a machine. You are a human person incarnated in a body, and that really matters. And your body images God. Second dominant idea of our age is this idea that we are autonomous, self-choosing individuals. Very popular idea, and this comes to us courtesy of Enlightenment liberalism. We could also add someone like, have I included him? No, I haven't. René Descartes, Immanuel Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And who am I missing? Scottish philosopher? I can't even know. Yes, who is the Scottish philosopher, the Enlightenment philosopher? I can't even remember his name now. How's that for bad? But these are the key Enlightenment philosophers of the Enlightenment liberal ideology. And one thing I think that's important to note about these men, and this is not something that I observed, I discovered this by reading people who are far smarter than I am. And some of these scholars have pointed out something interesting, that all of, David Hume, sorry, was the Scottish philosopher who was missing, that all of these men, they were childless. And I think this is an interesting observation. So these chaps here never had any children. René Descartes had one illegitimate daughter who died of illness before she even turned 5, and he had no other children. Jean-Jacques Rousseau infamously had 5 illegitimate children to his mistresses, and he abandoned all 5 of them to orphanages in their infancy. At a time in French history when it was well known that if you abandoned a child as an infant to an orphanage, there was an 80% chance they would not survive. And so what these scholars point out is that these men who never knew the authentic community and demands of family life, which in Christianity we might describe as the first and most important school of love, because it teaches us how to love. Our kids make big demands of us, our spouses make big demands of us, and we're called to give in self-giving love. They never knew that first and most important school of love. And they left the world with a bachelor philosophy. And what do bachelors do? They put themselves at the centre of everything. They think about their own needs before anything else. And I think that's a neat little way of summing up Enlightenment liberalism. In a nutshell, the Enlightenment liberal project tried to create something that we had never seen in human history before. They tried to create a society without a unifying sacred religious truth to guide that society. They said you could do it with just human reason alone. And what are we discovering now? Well, as the liberal state is in a state of collapse around the Western world right now, we're discovering it actually doesn't work. First time it was tried in history, and it actually doesn't work. Persons also should be understood as blank slates who will reason their way to truth if they are free to do so. This is the other big liberal claim, that you're actually just born as a blank slate, and that if you are freed from tyranny, then you'll start reasoning, all things being equal, and you will reason your way to the truth. The good ideas will rise to the top. I don't know if you've heard that before. That's a very liberal idea. What we're seeing now more and more is that in actual fact, that doesn't really seem to be the case. Get on social media any day of the week and you'll see a very clear example of how that doesn't actually seem to be true. And lastly, they would say that choice equals freedom, and the more choice equals the greater freedom you have. That's a fundamental claim of liberalism. In other words, wherever you hear someone say, my body, my choice, that's liberalism. This view that we are first and foremost autonomous, self-choosing individuals, and that no prior tradition or community can lay claim to the individual. This idea is very powerful. This is why today, for example, when it comes to government policies around the Western world, it is not unusual to see children being treated as autonomous, self-choosing individuals, as if they don't actually exist in a community, the family, the first and most important of all communities. It's not unusual to have policies that show no or very little regard for the proper rights and responsibilities of parents when it comes to raising their own children. That's liberalism, because it says, well, no, that community, the family, doesn't lay claim to them first of all. They are individuals, self-choosing individuals first and foremost, okay? Very dominant idea. So, if we are not autonomous, then what are we? Well, according to the Christian version of reality, we are individuals, but we are communal by nature. Those who are present this morning will remember this when I said, I do not bring myself into existence. The first and most important of all communities, the family, brings us into existence. I do not sustain my own existence, particularly in my early years. As an infant, I couldn't clothe, feed, hydrate, shelter, or care for myself. I need others to actually sustain and keep me alive. If I am someone who experiences disability, or I experience illness or infirmity, what do I need? I need the community around me to sustain my existence. And of course, I cannot flourish without community. I need to know at least one other person as friend to fully discover the fullness of what it is to be human, to receive them as gift and to give of my life in loving ways to them as well. And one other thing that's quite important is that without traditions that were given to me without my consent, I flounder and society ends up in crisis. My parents raised me to be a responsible man of virtue. Like all parents, they were imperfect at it, but they did their best, and I'm extremely grateful for that. But I never consented to that, and they didn't ask my permission. They said, this is how it's going to be, son. These are the rules. These are why. This tradition of virtue was given to me without my consent. And if I had not been given that, I wouldn't be a better person. I would be struggling in my life right now, and there's a real danger that I could even be someone who is antisocial or even criminal and doing harm to society around me. So this idea that no prior tradition can lay claim to the individual is one that is actually quite risky. In a nutshell, liberalism tried to keep the good fruit from the tree of Christianity without tending to the tree. And this is really important. So anything good you see in liberalism is lifted directly from Christianity, and then some other bad ideas were added into the mix. But the problem was that liberalism didn't want to keep the tree, it just wanted the fruit. And it didn't want to tend to that tree. And what that means is that it has left us in a world without a shared concept of the good. Well, you just make it up for yourself. You decide for yourself what the good is, what morally good means, what human dignity means. And this has created a massive existential crisis, a crisis of meaning is what that means. A demographic crisis now. We have not had enough children, and we are heading into some very perilous waters all over the globe because we haven't had enough kids. And on the back of these ideas. And also a societal crisis. We are increasingly finding ourselves separated from each other. And part of the reason was, as I said, that liberalism didn't tend to the tree of Christianity, and the reason it was able to get away with this for so long was liberalism arose within a Christian culture where people weren't actually liberals, they were Christians. But as that Christianity waned and disappeared because no one was really tending to it like they should have, and then different branches of liberalism sprung up which actually started taking an axe to the tree of Christianity, the tree has gone, the fruit has disappeared, and now we want the fruit but we don't know where to find it. There's been a lot of conversation recently since the killing of Charlie Kirk in America about the need for peaceful civil public discourse. Well, that rests surely on the idea that every other person you disagree with is made in the image of God and has human dignity, and you should treat them with basic respect. That idea doesn't come from liberalism. It comes from the Christian vision of reality. And the last thing I'll say about this that's important is that in the Christian vision of reality, authentic freedom is not the same thing as choice. Authentic freedom is the freedom to do what is good, true, and beautiful. And here's the paradox. The more I commit myself to what is good, true, and beautiful, and surrender myself to that, the greater my personal freedom and flourishing actually becomes. It's kind of like playing the piano, right? There's two ways you can approach the piano. Imagine this piano is life, is the human experience. One way to approach it is the liberal way and say, well, it's all about choice. Don't worry about those prior traditions. You don't have to worry about them. It's all about your personal choice. And the more choice you have, the freer you'll be. I'm not going to spend my time, listening to those outdated rules about music, where to put your fingers to play a D chord. I'll put my fingers wherever I want, and I'll call that a D chord. I'm even going to play with my feet. I'm very enlightened, right? My children used to do this. We had a piano in our lounge, and they would open the piano. They couldn't play, and they would open the piano, and they'd bash away, and they'd say, "Dad, it's the Wiggles." And I'd think to myself, unless the Wiggles are doing death metal now, then I don't think this is what the Wiggles sound like, kids. They would bash away for a bit, make a bit of noise, have a bit of fun, and then leave. But there's another way to approach a piano. The other way is to say, you know what, I think there is actually a right way and a wrong way to play the piano. I think there's a prior tradition, wisdom that might help me here. And when I submit myself to those supposedly outdated laws of music, what happens? I don't lose my freedom grows. I now have the ability to play beautiful music on this piano. And the more I do this, the more my freedom grows. I can actually begin to write my own music. You see the difference here? When I submit myself to what is good, true, and beautiful, I flourish. Jesus says it like this: if you want to find your life, you've first got to lose it, to lay it down. It's a paradox, but a profoundly important one. I can't remember who it was. I think it was one of the American founders who once said that freedom is only a good horse to get on and ride if you've got somewhere to ride it. It's no good just getting on and riding around in chaos, okay? So freedom that is not directed towards that which is good, true, and beautiful is not actually going to help us to grow in freedom. Freedom and choice are not the same thing in the Christian vision of reality. So, the third of our very powerful secularizing forces is this idea that we actually are self-creating, that we should create meaning for ourselves in the world. Rather than discovering meaning, we should create it for ourselves. Does anybody know the source of this idea? Very important thinker actually in shaping Western thought, and it's none other than Friedrich Nietzsche, winner of the Moustache of the Year award multiple times in the late 1800s, okay? Friedrich Nietzsche is a man whose life is riddled with contradictions and ironies. He is a man who started as a pastor's son, the son of a pastor, and then went on to happily bear the label of the Antichrist. He was quite proud of being called the Antichrist. He was a man, the stories tell us of his history, who sat in the choir loft in his father's church as the choir were practicing and was enraptured by it, and everyone thought he was going to follow in his father's footsteps. But then his father died a very difficult death after a difficult illness, and his brother died as well prematurely. And this clearly shaped his vision of reality, his way of thinking about the world, these moments of suffering. And what Friedrich Nietzsche said was this. He produced several works, and one of them was called The Genealogy of Morals, and in it he said this. Basically, he said the Jews were they had invented this idea of moral conscience and these universal moral laws that are binding on the human person. And the reason he said they created these was because they were much weaker than their pagan neighbours who were much stronger, and this was the only way that because they were resentful of their neighbours, this was the only way to level the playing field. They couldn't go to war against them, he said, but what they did was they said they're offending God. Right? We are the chosen ones. They're not living up to God's chosen commands. Now, when you read that, you probably think this guy sounds like an anti-Semite. This is the irony. He wasn't. He actually opposed anti-Semitism. The reason he gets associated with the Nazis, the last 11 years of his life, he actually goes mad, and he's in an insane asylum. His sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, who was actually a Nazi, took his works, and after his death, she posthumously published his notes from what he called The Will to Power. The Will to Power wasn't even finished at the time he died, and it was published after he died, and the Nazis took that as their guiding light when they created their big Nuremberg rallies with the torches and the pillars. And I'll tell you why. So for Friedrich Nietzsche, he said this claim that there are moral obligations on us that we're all bound by and that we should all consider. He said this is basically a way of weakening society. And he said Christianity was even worse because it promotes what he called a morality of slaves. Why? Because he said Christianity talks about compassion and mercy. You know what he says? Friedrich Nietzsche says, you know who is obsessed with compassion and mercy? The slave is, because they're powerless. You know who doesn't need to talk about compassion and mercy? The master, because he's powerful. And what he's doing here is he is adopting a pagan idea about power. And basically what he says is the pre-Christian pagan societies were better because they were stronger and they weren't afraid to use power on their weaker enemies to remake the world in their own image. So for Friedrich Nietzsche, Christianity is not something that he simply disagrees with. He thinks it's morally evil because he thinks it's weakening and destroying Western society. And just in case you're in any doubt, let me quote to you from the man himself so we're clear. Christianity is the greatest of all imaginable corruptions, the most fatal and seductive lie that has ever yet existed, the most repugnant kind of degeneracy that civilization has ever brought into existence, the only unquenchable infamy of mankind. Tell us what you really think, Frederick. Right? There's no holds barred, no punches pulled there at all, right? So for Friedrich Nietzsche, he says, well, okay, Christianity is not the answer, he claims, because it makes us weak. What we need to do is recognize that former pagan era when they celebrated strength. And we need to deify strength. And we need what he called the Übermensch, the overman, the strong man who will lead us forward, who will seize power and do what needs to be done to create the world anew. So for Friedrich Nietzsche, power is not just good, it's almost like God. And he promotes an idea of self-creation. Famously, he writes one day, God is dead and we have killed him. Basically, what he's saying there is two things. Number one, he is very critical of the Enlightenment, because all these Enlightenment thinkers are talking about principles of truth and goodness, and he says, you're all speaking like there's still a God, but God is dead, remember, we have killed him. So in one sense, he's aware, okay, where are we going to get our morality from now? Because Christianity gave that to the West. Where are we going to get it from? And he said, we will be the Übermensch now who will create meaning for ourselves in the world. God is dead, we have killed him, we are the new gods now. And so he's celebrating that fact as well. And if you were to say to me, Brendan, is there one thinker who is responsible for shaping the secular mind more than any other? I'd say it doesn't work that way. But if you put a gun to my head and forced me, I'd say Friedrich Nietzsche is absolutely one of the most pivotal reasons that our world looks the way that it does today. He is profoundly influential in shaping thought that comes after him. In fact, Sigmund Freud once said, who was, someone who was quite influential in his own right, but Sigmund Freud once said, I had to stop reading Friedrich Nietzsche because I was afraid that if I didn't, I would not have an original idea of my own to give to the world. So Friedrich Nietzsche is very influential. Freud, by the way, adopted this sort of idea, and he said, well, personal happiness is our source of flourishing. Self-gratification, that's how we find our meaning in the world. He also was opposed to Christianity, but he recognized that Christians were actually pretty good people to live next door to because they weren't barbarians. They didn't wander around chopping your head off and taking all your stuff. But he said, we don't need that anymore. That's outdated superstition. But if people find their own personal happiness, they'll be happy and they won't want to be barbarians. This is how we'll solve that problem. So, if we are not self-creating, then what are we? We are created and we are recreated in God, in Christ, and the Christian vision of reality. I talked about this morning. The Imago Dei, the image of God. Every person is made in the image of God and has profound human dignity as a result. In the Christian vision of reality, God is a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a community of three divine persons engaged in an eternal act of self-giving love. So that means we who are made in that image are made for community and we are made for self-giving love. Freud was wrong as well. We are not made for self-gratification. That's not the path to happiness at all. Instead, our human flourishing is not found in the pursuit of happiness, but in the love of God and the love of neighbour. And when we give ourselves to that, we discover our humanity in a profound way as it was created to be. We become more like God intended us to be. We really, truly do flourish. I've got two more quickly to wrap us up, but what I'd like you to do now is I want to take just a quick pause, and I'd like you actually just to stand up where you are, please, everybody. And what I'd like you to do is, with the person nearest to you, just share one idea that you've perhaps found interesting or maybe challenging so far in what we've talked about. Take 30 seconds and share that with the person beside you now. Right, let's grab a seat again. 2 more to go. The fourth of the very powerful ideas that shape the modern secular mind is this idea that we are political by nature. And this idea comes to us courtesy of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is focused primarily on the distribution of power. He is exploring and looking at economic issues in his age, and he does see a class struggle of sorts happening in society. And he divides society into two. And what he says is there are the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie, depending on which side of the tracks you come from. And the bourgeois are the elites who own everything. They own the farms, the factories, the powerful, the elite, the wealthy. They're the bourgeois. And then the other class is what he calls the proletariat. And they are the working classes. And he says they are being oppressed by the bourgeois. And what he does is he sets up a vision of history where basically human history is a constant cycle of revolution and resolution. And what he does is he says that every age has an internal struggle. And this internal struggle will lead to a revolution, and the revolution overthrows and ushers in the next new age of history. And he says capitalism is the great oppressor of our age, and there will be an overthrow of capitalism. He says it will happen, it would be nice if this happened, but this will definitely happen. It's like a prophecy that he gives. This is going to happen. And this is the struggle of our age. Capitalism will be overthrown, and the new age of history, the new Jerusalem, you might have described it as, will be ushered in as a result. Basically, what he does is he sets up a vision of reality where you have oppression and oppressed people constantly at war with each other in human society and human history. And history becomes a cycle of oppression and revolution. Now, how does he politicize everything, though? Well, when he infamously writes that religion is the opiate of the masses, and what he means is Christianity here. What is an opiate? An opioid drug. In his age, what did you use opiates for? You gave them to people in asylums. And you gave them opiates so they would be dumbed down and sedated. They would sit in a chair, they might drool, they'd look out the window, but they wouldn't cause you any problems. And so in other words, what he's claiming here is that the Christian faith is keeping us all dumbed down and making us weak. Friedrich Nietzsche. Right? That's where that idea comes from. That it's making us weak, and it means that we don't want to rise up and throw off the shackles of our oppressors. How does this politicize everything, though? Well, if the first and most important, most sacred of all human relationships, the relationship between a human being and God, if that's political, then everything else, which is less important, must also be political as well. Everything becomes politicized at that moment. And then what happens after him is his failed prediction about the collapse of capitalism, which didn't happen, it's still with us today. And interestingly enough too, things must have changed by the end of Marx's life, because by the end of his life, he owned stocks and shares, so he was involved in capitalism himself. So either he's the world's biggest hypocrite, or he felt things had changed for workers in the factories, and to be fair, they had. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why Marxism is so enduring and is still with us today, because it was actually very effective, it still is, at pointing out flaws in capitalism. Its solutions are terrible, you don't want those, but it is pretty good at diagnosing problems. And so people who know there's something not right, or they see deficiencies in capitalism, and they hear Marxism saying, we've got the answers, it's very easy to get fooled and lulled into that. I remember being in my 20s and thinking, I'm pretty sure communism is just applied Christianity. If you put Christ at the head of it, you'd be right. I was wrong, okay? There's an old saying, you may have heard it, if you're not a communist in your 20s, you might not have a heart. If you're still a communist in your 40s, you might not have a brain. Okay? So it's not a good idea that you want to hold on to. It's got plenty of flaws. But his failed prediction doesn't happen, and this gives rise to what is known as neo-Marxism or new Marxism. And the neo-Marxists are trying to explain why his prophecy didn't come true. And they say, he was focused only on economic struggle. It's bigger than that. It's everywhere. There's oppression all through society. Neo-Marxism became what we would call today cultural Marxism, where people are seeing oppressed and oppressor groups everywhere. And before we move on, I just want to leave you with a quote from one of the first neo-Marxists, because I think it gives us an interesting insight. His name was Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian politician. He was one of the neo-Marxists, one of the first and a very important one in that movement. And a group of his fellow socialists had written an essay, a public letter, and they'd said, isn't communism just practical Christianity? And he replied and said, no way. They are opposed to each other. Remember, he's a communist himself. He says communism and Christianity, it's like oil and water. It's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. And he wrote a public essay, a response to them called Audacity and Faith. And this is the bit I want to quote to you. Socialism is precisely the religion that must kill Christianity. Religion in the sense that socialism too is a faith. That socialism has its mystics and its practitioners. Religion because it replaced the transcendent God of the Catholics in our consciences with the trust in man and his best efforts as the only spiritual reality. Our gospel is a modern philosophy, one that dispenses with the hypothesis of God and the vision of the universe, one that lays its foundations only in history, a history in which we are the creatures of the past and the creators of the future. That's Friedrich Nietzsche again. We are the new gods now. We will create meaning for ourselves. Now, it's not just that he's identifying, he views Christianity as the enemy here. What's also going on here is that politics has now become religion. That's a very, very different state of affairs. And we really are carrying that burden today in a huge way. So, if we're not political, what does the Christian vision of reality say? It says that we are relational. We are not political, we are relational. And politics just happens to be one form of relating between human beings. So does economics. It involves trade, but it's a way of relating between human beings. So, as I talked about this morning, the Christian vision of reality is relational. First and most important relationship we are called into, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Second most important, love your neighbour as yourself. And third, we are called to be stewards of the created order of creation. So there's a type of relationship with creation that we have as well. So, Marx was wrong. We are not what some call homo politicus, political man. No, that's not correct. And we are also not homo economicus, economic man. St. Augustine said it best when he said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. We are relational. We are created for relationship. And by the way, this has implications not just for communism, but for any other ideology or the excesses of capitalism that would want to reduce human beings to just economic units. It's very, very important to understand about the Christian vision of reality. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Lastly, the dominant hallmark of the modern secular mind is this idea of what some call the myth of progress. That technology, that science will save us. This idea comes to us courtesy of this man here, Francis Bacon, the father of empiricism and one of the fathers of the modern scientific revolution. And he once said the following: knowledge is power. And what he meant by that is, as our knowledge of the natural world grows, of the natural sciences, so will our power over nature. Our technology will get better and we will free ourselves from the enslavement of nature. In his work, Novum Organum, this is how he put it: the triumph of art over nature will be achieved. Victoria cursus artis super naturam. The triumph of art over nature. We will no longer be enslaved by nature. Now, there's some problems here, though. Now, first of all, it is true, as our power and it grows, I'm standing here talking to you tonight, and you can all hear me at the back of the room, thanks to this technological advancement called a microphone and an amplification system. You can see me because we have lights. We're not bound by darkness. We don't have to all hide away at night because we can't see each other. Vaccines free us from certain diseases. But what he's done here is he's actually set up a relationship between human beings and nature and the natural world where nature is our enslaver that we've got to fight back against. We're no longer stewards of God's good created order. The created order is now enslaving us in this vision of reality. And this raises some interesting questions. So, is there any limits to this power over nature? Should it be governed by morality, or should we just use technology because we've discovered it? And of course, empiricism, Francis Bacon's philosophy, doesn't have an answer to that question. What we are seeing here is this idea of dominion over nature, which was given by God originally in the garden and then lost to us through original sin. Instead, it would be re-established, not with God, but without God, with science. We would re-establish our dominion, our control. We would force our way back into Eden, effectively. We wouldn't trust in the kingdom of God. We'd look to the kingdom of man for our answers. Now, this is not a simple denial of faith. Faith is now reduced to a private matter that's about otherworldly affairs. and is deemed to be irrelevant in the world in which we live. Science has the answers for this world in which we live. That's otherworldly. Sure, if you want to believe that stuff, but it's got no binding claims on anybody. So you see what's happening here? This is really quite profound, the change. And hope changes as well. Hope is no longer about faith in God, but faith in science, faith in progress. We no longer seek our redemption through faith in God, we seek our redemption through our technological power. In fact, Francis Bacon, he didn't finish it, but he wrote a utopian work called The New Atlantis, which was a society which was governed by scientists and scientific planners. He felt they would be the best to lead us. And what we end up with on the back of this is we end up with things like the evils of eugenics, the surgical mutilation of healthy bodies, holocausts, growing distrust even in our own ears and eyes. Think about artificial intelligence and its ability to create fake audio that sounds like someone you love, and you can't tell the difference. Think about, and they are talking about this very seriously at the judicial and at the government level. Imagine the potential of watching a video one day of someone who appears to be committing a crime and you can't tell that it's fake. What does that mean? We can't trust our own eyes and ears anymore. So all of a sudden, this freeing ourselves from nature with lots of technology and progress doesn't actually look so much like liberation at all. It looks a lot more like enslavement. So, if it's not the myth of progress that we should be looking to, our technology to save us, Christianity would say we seek our redemption in Christ. That is the only true source of redemption. Redemption through faith. Hope in the kingdom of God, not in the kingdom of man. Thirdly, science is a tool in the Christian vision of reality. It is not a saviour. It's a very helpful tool at times, but it must be governed by moral truth. You don't just use technology simply because you possess it. It must be directed towards the good of the human person, right? Not against them. And what's important is that if we have this recognition of our need for redemption from beyond our own humanity, so we say we don't save ourselves, God saves us, this has important implications for how we view and how we use power. Because we recognize I can't save myself, I'm just a fallible human being. So therefore, I need to be careful about how I use power and how I wield power, because I could easily become corrupted by that. It's a very, very important truth that Christianity gives to the world. So, if I was to end this presentation now and say, good night everybody, you'd probably say, gosh, I hope they're giving out antidepressants on the way out tonight, right? But what I want to do just quickly in the last couple of minutes is just wrap this up by giving you a couple of quick suggestions about how I think we should navigate the current cultural context we find ourselves in. Number one is I think we need to remember the importance of discernment. And in particular, when you're engaging with any form of media, mainstream news media, social media, or entertainment media. We often forget about that one. We are living in a very propagandized age. And these ideologies are just baked into a lot of even the entertainment media we watch. And as Christians, we can very easily become like frogs in a pot, boiling away and not realizing that our vision of reality is being pulled in directions that aren't actually consistent with the mind of Christ. So be discerning. That's number one. Number two is humility. Not just because humility is the queen of the virtues and so fundamentally essential to the Christian life. You know, Nietzsche was wrong. I am not God. I am in need of God. So humility is absolutely essential. But also we need to have the humility to recognize, well, there but for the grace of God go you or I. I look at my own life and very easily, few different twists and turns, I might not have been standing here before you tonight. I could have bought into some of these ideologies very easily. And I could have been preaching a false doctrine to a whole different group of people. So we need to have the humility to recognize that. And what that means is instead of looking down our nose at other people who maybe are caught up in some of these ideologies, we've got to love them. Right? Live the truth and love it well, love them well. Which brings me to my third point, and this comes to us courtesy of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Christian dissident of Soviet communism, who wrote a very important essay one day, which you can read online. It's not long. I encourage you to do it, called Live Not by Lies. And what he said is a very important principle here. You might be living in an age, like I think we are now, where you don't have the power to actually stop these dominant ideologies. They're just so powerful and consuming. But he says, you know what? That doesn't mean we're powerless. He He said, we always have the power to refuse to live the lie. Don't let the lie hold through you, no matter what it is. Live the truth in your heart, your mind, your speech, your business dealings, your interactions with others, your family life. Live not by lies. And what happens? The lie arrives at the doorstep of your heart and it dies very quickly. And it's a profoundly important way of shaping the culture around you. We often hear people today saying that culture is like a pendulum. Don't worry, Brendan, it'll swing back. To which I say, I've got some history books you should read, because in actual fact, if you read history, you realize the pendulum sometimes does not swing back at all. It just keeps on going right off the edge, and cultures collapse. Culture is not like this, it's all over the place. Sorry, history is not like this. It's not a constant upward trajectory, it's all over the place, right? And if we abandon and lose sight of fundamental truths, then cultures can actually collapse. I think a better metaphor is to think of culture like a garden. And it seems to be a very scriptural metaphor as well. And this idea that each of us is given a patch of soil that we are entrusted with. And what do you do if you want a good garden with good fruit, with good vegetables, with beautiful flowers? You've got to plant the right seeds in the garden. But it's not enough just to plant the seeds, you've got to nurture them as well. And you've got to deal with the weeds. And it's a constant process. But here's the thing. Even in a cultural garden that might be overgrown with weeds, our little patch of soil can still offer salt and light to the world around us. When people look at our patch of soil with our good green earth that we've been given and they see in our lives good fruit, it's very, very attractive to people. If you will allow me to, I'd like to leave you with this quote from Tom Holland. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Tom Holland, but Tom Holland was an agnostic. He was a person who did not believe in God, and he is a very renowned historian. Actually, he's an Englishman, and he was studying his specialty, which is the Greek and Roman world. And one day it dawned on him that these Greeks and Romans, they don't think like I do, he said. And he realized it wasn't just because they were ancient and I was modern. They view morality and the human person different to how I do today as a modern man. Why is that? And that study, that question, led him on a whole path of research, which led to his conclusion, which is absolutely true, that even as someone who's not Christian, I am steeped in the Christian vision of reality in the West. That's why I think so differently. And he wrote a book called Dominion, all about how fundamentally important Christianity is and was in shaping the West. And this is what Tom Holland said. This was his advice to Christian leaders one day. Rather than speaking with the voice of prophecy, rather than explaining to a grieving and anxious people how the dead will rise into the blaze of eternal life, rather than proclaiming the miracles and mysteries that they uniquely exist to proclaim, church leaders seem to have opted instead to talk like middle managers. The future for the churches is to remind people where these ideas come from. They come from believing in mad things, that there is a God who created all human beings equally, gave them an inherent dignity because they're created in God's image. People want the supernatural, they want the strange, they want what they don't get out of a Labour Party manifesto. Now, anyone who votes Labour, this is not an attack on you, it's out of any political party manifesto. That's Marx's mistake, right? Looking for politics to save us. And he's absolutely right. And this is why I do the work that I do, and I really have come to love this work. And I believe as Christians we're called to, through our lives, our words, our deeds, to awaken in people a sense of sacred wonder. There is a God. There is something profoundly more to this life than I've been led to believe. I can look up and I can discover goodness, truth, and beauty that will radically change my life and for all of eternity. And it's not just a good idea. It's not simply an idea worth living for. It's an idea that is so good, true, and beautiful that it is worth dying for. I will not let go of it, even if it costs me my life. That is a profoundly good, true, and beautiful thing to have discovered and to have lived your life by, and you only get there through Christ. Thank you so much for listening, and it's been an absolute blessing to be with you this evening. Thank you.